Bună seara, doamnelor și domnilor! Vă mulțumim că sunteți alături de noi. Ascultați Radio AVTM, Vocea Europei.
Jó estét, hölgyeim és uraim! Köszönjük figyelmüket! Önök az a Voice Former Rádió Európa hangja műsorát hallgatják.
And, good evening ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. You are listening to a Voice for Men radio, the voice of Europe. A Voice for Men is the flagship of the men's rights movement. And this show is probably the only one at this point addressing the issues concerning men and boys at a European level. If you ever thought that there's something wrong regarding the state's approach to men and their issues, this is the best place to start. This is the place where feminism gets to be called out on its lies and propaganda, and the state is invited to get out of people's lives. Please consider visiting avoiceformen.com and see how the truth in action sounds like. We are here and we don't plan on leaving anytime soon. And now, Lucian Vâlsan shall bring us on today's topic.
Everyone, this is Lucian Vâlsan, broadcasting from Cluj-Napoca, Transylvania. As always, alongside with me is Jon Gunnarsson, broadcasting from Deutschland, and our producer James Huff, lurking in the background and making sure this thing actually works. Hi there, Jon.
Hello, comrade. How are you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine after being part of the working class last week. And after a period of intense labor and hardly joking, I'm finally enjoying a day when I didn't actually have to do too much. And also enjoying the good weather. I mean, finally today the weather resembled more like end of May, early June, as opposed to the beginning of the week. I think it was Tuesday morning, there was 0 degrees in Celsius in the early in the morning at 6 a.m. Amazing.
That is quite cold.
It is.
Yeah, the weather has been quite nice mostly. I mean, it rained for a brief while today, but otherwise it's been quite good and sunny and mild weather. So can't complain on that front.
Yeah, well, in here it's been a sunny, 30 degrees in Celsius or 29, whatever. Mostly what I would expect from this period. Hopefully the 0 degrees in Celsius won't come back until, I don't know, October. I'm sick and tired of bad weather. Before going to the news, I must say that one of the reasons why this episode is called the News Hour is because essentially sooner rather than later, hopefully by episode 100, will become a news-only show. That's mainly because all the big topics have been covered in the last 2 years, and yeah, more or less, there's no point in going 2 hours, and we should probably try to go 1 hour and a half, or even less, as long as possible, if topics allow. Anyway, in order to go shorter, I should probably speak less and go straight to the news.
You are listening to AVFM Radio, the voice of Europe. This is the news.
Alright, the first piece of news is from the Telegraph from the UK. Why doesn't society care about male rape? Male rape survivor John Lennon is adamant that group therapy at a dedicated male-only support network helped save his life. Lennon's attacker was sentenced to 4 years and 3 months after he brutally raped him for 3.5 hours at his flat in Manchester in August 2010. At the end of his horrific ordeal, Lennon needed plastic surgery to rebuild his battered face, but it was his shattered mind that would bear the bigger scars. Yet, like many survivors of male rape, he had no idea where to turn for help. Quote, "After my attack I was suicidal, and in desperation called a rape crisis helpline, but the woman said, 'This service is for women only,' and hung up on me," says Lennon, 45, from Manchester. "I don't blame her, but I feel so angry and dejected that they turned men away. Luckily, I used my anger to get help. Then Lennon found out about Survivors Manchester, one of only 20 services nationwide that offer help to male rape victims and one of 4 that offer male-dedicated help. And his slow path to recovery began. Quote, I started 2 years of group therapy, which is crucial, he says. It makes you feel like you're not alone, not such damaged goods, like a whole human again. Yet in spite of Jon's experience that single-sex therapy is essential, Survivors UK, based in London and the UK's biggest male-only victim support group, has recently had its funding slashed to 0, meaning the only male-dedicated service in London now has to turn desperate men like Lennon away, despite the staggering 120% increase in male rape in the capital in 2 years. Police crime figures for 2014 in England and Wales show there were 38,134 incidents of rape or sexual assault of a woman and 3,580 against men. Yet, due to the shame and stigma surrounding perhaps the darkest male taboo of all, Survivors UK believe only 2 to 3% of men report their rapes. Official figures for women are 10 to 12% reporting, meaning many thousands of men are suffering in silence. Furthermore, there are an estimated 1.5 million adult male survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the UK. Abuse against boys accounts for around 70% of cases. London has the highest national prevalence, and in 2014, 307 men reported being raped to the Metropolitan Police, an increase of 120% over 2012 figures. In addition, 518 men experienced a serious sexual assault, an increase of 80% in 2012. In 2014, in London, the mayor allocated £1.3 million to provide specialist support services for victims of sexual assault in London. Of that, 33,000 or 2.5% was spent on specialist services supporting men and boys. Incredulously, as of April 1 this year, that funding was cut to 0. Yet a petition to press the mayor for critical funding has so far only attracted 699 signatures. To put that in context, the recent petition to remove the Protein World ads from the London Underground attracted 71,111 signatures. Michael May, director of Survivors UK, says he feels utterly betrayed by the mayor's decision to slash his funding to nothing. And skipping a few bits here, quote, I felt hopeless and disappointed. For the last 6 years, I've asked them what they are doing to support male victims of violence, and they have never ever answered me in any direct way, other than to say that they have no money. We've had to close our group therapy because we can't afford to fund it. On an individual therapy level, we've had to turn people away and put them on a waiting list. We have 40 people in our service and we cannot let any more in until others leave. In the last month, we had 18 referrals. That's growing every day. Yet we have to reject them. It's heartbreaking. Skipping some more. Quote, I feel utterly betrayed, says May. 8 years ago, the Labour Party came up with the Violence Against Women Cross-Party Action Plan, which was an amazing piece of legislation. But I said to ministers, including Harriet Harman, can we not just say it's for women and children? And they said, absolutely not. It has to say women and girls, because that's the strategy. So now we have a situation where there's a violence against women and girls strategy, but not one that includes men or boys. John Lennon, who has written a book called My Journey to Justice, is adamant that survivors saved him and leads the call for the mayor to reconsider its funding. Without help from organizations like Survivors, I'd probably be dead, he says. I felt worthless and was suicidal, but they gave me hope. They gave a silent, shamed minority a vital voice. So, comments? I guess not. So I do think this is good news that newspapers like the Telegraph are reporting on this, because it is, of course, an issue that is very often overlooked. I think it's somewhat problematic, the figures they give here with these 2 to 3% of men reporting their rapes and 10 to 12% of women reporting, because you just can't know that. That's
And
just complete guesstimating that they're doing there. And
guesstimating would guesstimating would be to put it kindly. I would rather say it's numbers pulled out of the bag. I mean, come on.
yeah, it really is more or less unknowable in practical terms how many percent of people actually report this. I mean, you can sort of do very rough estimations by asking people in service whether they have been victims of these crimes, but then you have the problem of, are people answering honestly and so on. So it's very difficult to say that. And so I mean, I can certainly believe that the proportion of men reporting rape is lower than women, but how high that proportion is and by how much it is lower, I really have no idea, and I don't really think we can make any confident assertions about that.
Yeah, fair enough. That's exactly what I said, but my microphone instead remained set on stereo mix.
Okay.
Essentially, that's my only disagreement with this article. That portion of how many do report, 3% versus 12%. I'm not buying that. Other than that, it kind of makes sense. Although it needs to be noticed that from the total pool of what, 1.29 million pounds, it was 2.5% allocated to specialist services supporting men and boys, and even that one got cut.
Yeah.
I mean,
if we just even just look at the official figures, and we have what was it?
3,500 and something.
Yeah, so men are something like a little under 10% of all cases. So I don't know, allocating something like 10% would seem reasonable, but I guess
Yeah,
not. I guess
even from a statist
2.5% are
perspective.
already too much.
Yeah, and a portion that I really liked in this article is that one. The petition to overcome this attracted 699 signature. Put that into context with the
Yeah.
Protein World petition. That was spot on, really was, and it pretty much goes to show how much the compassionate left actually gives a damn about people who are indeed oppressed. I mean, I don't know, having to go to surgery to refix your face, that counts as being oppressed, at least in my book. I don't know, maybe my book is wrong. And how much and I specifically emphasize on the left because of this portion with Harry and Harmon. Oh, absolutely not. It has to say women and girls because that's the strategy. So we already know how much the left really does give a damn about the so-called downtrodden and oppressed and you name it. Yeah, of course. Amazing.
Yeah, because it would go counter to their sort of central idea that there's this linear model of oppression where there's one group that is the oppressor and one group that is the oppressed in every given interaction, and you just can't have it that men are being raped because that's supposed to be an oppression that women suffer. So if they admit all these complications, then their arguments just become a lot weaker.
Yeah, and we can't have nuance in any kind of policy. I mean, come on.
Oh yes, you can have nuance, but only if it supports their case, only if it supports what they actually want. So if there's an argument made by someone on the right, say, then they can attack that argument for oversimplifying things and not having enough nuance and so on. That's perfectly fine, but it doesn't work the other way around.
Yeah, and then the Labour Party wonders why they can't win any elections. Well, and this attack on Harmon comes very timely right after the elections when the Labour Party essentially portrayed itself as the party of women. And Mike explained to us last episode a little bit, but it was even more than that. I mean, besides the constituencies where J4MB ran, there was a national campaign going with pink cars and essentially taking the women voters for granted. And I guess most British women didn't really like that.
Yeah, and I mean, Harriet Harman is now even the acting leader of the Labour Party, so she is at least for now quite important in British politics. So it's not exactly like some radical fringe weirdo that's saying these things.
Yeah, it's not. And again, Harriet Harman has quite consistently occupied some relevant positions, not just when the Labour Party was in power, but also afterwards. She was usually either shadow minister for equalities, shadow minister for whatever. She was always a relevant individual. And to her credit, and I must say it, to her credit, Harriet Harman is at least the kind of feminist that is actually honest. I mean, I've never heard Harriet Harman trying to weasel out of a controversial statement that she made. No. She's very honest. Yes, it has to be this way and unidirectional because I say so, and fuck off.
Yeah, there's something to be appreciated about that.
Yep. Okay.
None of this third wave feasibly bullshit where it's all about inclusivity and we want to have diversity and so on. No, it's just straight up. We just want to favor women and fuck off. At least you know where you're standing with her.
Yeah, you know where you're standing with her, and it also makes the whole debate far more honest. I mean, at least when at least one side, usually both sides, take a consistent position, and you go from there. At least you know what you're debating, as opposed to what you said, third wave bullshit, where you don't even know what you're debating, since the opposition keeps moving the goalposts.
Yep.
Okay, let's go to the next one.
Okay, this one is a really short excerpt. It's from CNS News. Pope, decline of marriage, quote, is a form of male chauvinism. Speaking at a general audience in St. Peter's Square in Rome last week, Pope Francis said that the decline of marriage in modern society, quote, is a form of male chauvinism. This is a matter of young people not wanting to marry. This matter of young people not wanting to marry is one of the emerging concerns of today. Why aren't young people getting married? The Pope said. Why is it that they frequently prefer cohabitation and, quote, limited responsibility, unquote? Many believe that the changes that have occurred in the last decades were put in motion by the emancipation of women, said the Pope. But even this argument is invalid. It is false. It isn't true. It's a form of male chauvinism, which always seeks to dominate women. And the article goes on after that, but even if you view it in the full context, this quote doesn't really sound any better than it sounds here. So,
yeah. I don't know. I've never been a Catholic. I am not a Catholic, and I will never be a Catholic. So anything I say should be considered through this prism. Am I a bad person if I say that this Pope is just utterly insane? I mean, it is not the first insanity that comes out of his mouth. Definitely won't be the last one. And every single thing that he says seems to be quite consistent with, let's say, with the leftist narrative. A few months ago, he was condemning the very idea of free market. 2 months ago was also bashing men for some other things. I mean, what the hell? Wasn't the Vatican supposed to be a socially conservative place?
Yeah, and more than that, Pope Francis sounds like a really stupid leftist.
Yep.
It's like he is not offering insightful critiques or anything like that. He's just spouting stupid talking points.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly not much of a fan of previous popes, but at least with those you sort of knew what you were getting, and I didn't agree with them, but at least they sort of offered a coherent position, and but here it just seems like this is just a white-robed clown.
Yeah. Now I have to be fair. I was a little bit more of a fan of John Paul II, but that's probably my Eastern European bias. Uh, I mean, the guy actually was adamant against communism, and I really liked that at him.
Mhm.
But going beyond that, I don't know what Pope Francis wants to achieve. I mean, what's his game? Because again, this statement doesn't come as a one-off. It's a consistent pattern in this individual, and I don't know what's his game.
I don't know. I guess it's just this sort of uh, Southern American liberation theology stuff that I don't know. It just
I was thinking about the same thing.
seems
Yeah.
just like populist nonsense to me.
Yeah, I was reading about liberation theology in the, I think it was in the National Post. It was an article written by Ioan Mihai Pacepa talking about how liberation theology is, as you said, essentially populist nonsense, at first funded by the KGB, and then even the KGB considered that it was too nonsensical to, to support it, but then it continued to grow to the extent that it is now, and probably liberation theology explains how a supposedly bastion of social conservatism and Catholicism, such as Argentina, is adamantly to vote in power commies. I guess that kind of explains it a little bit.
Well, I mean, if you go to the Gospels, you can certainly find some rather sort of pro-socialistic ideas there, but I mean, supposedly the Catholic Church is supposed to be more about tradition and about the interpretation of the Bible and so on, and about catechisms and so on, not about going back to the source material as much. So it just seems rather weird to see this in the context of Catholicism.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, Mean Gene says in the chat room, well, it seems that his game is socialism. Well, maybe, but this is going to affect. I mean, the Catholic Church, I know it had some image problems in the last 20 years for obvious reasons. Most of them deserved. But trying to fix the image through this nonsense, I'm not really sure it's going to work. I mean, I would even argue that would make things even worse. Because you don't start fixing your image problem by alienating your base, I would guess. I mean, that's not how I would do it. But what do I know? I'm not a Catholic, so yeah.
Yeah, I think we should move on to the next one.
Yep. Let's move to the next one, which is good news, I would say, considering where it comes from. It comes from freatider.se from Sweden. Polisen erkänner diskriminerade svenska män. The police admits they discriminated against Swedish men. For several years, the police denied engaging in extensive ethnic and sex discrimination in admissions to the police academy. But a recent ruling by the Stockholm District Court put an end to this. The police have indeed violated the Discrimination Act and are now forced to pay large damages to 4 victims. 4.5 years ago, Daniel Stahl and another 3 men sued the police authority for discrimination in their admissions to the police academy. The Foundation Center for Justice took their case and helped them in court. Like thousands of others over the years who sought admission to the police academy, they found out an admission system that contained a profound discrimination on grounds of sex and ethnicity. Although over two-thirds of the candidates were men, and men did better in both physical and language tests, somehow exactly half of those admitted were women. Faced with a planned main hearing in the District Court of Stockholm, police found no other option but to backtrack. The other day, the court issued a judgment on the case and ordered the police to pay 100,000 svenske kronor, that's almost 11,000 euros, to each of the victims, and the police agreed to pay. This is very important. The police have effectively admitted that they have been discriminated on grounds of sex and ethnic background. We will monitor very closely how the police and political leaders handle this to ensure this is not repeated, says Clarence Crawford, head of the Center for Justice and counsel in the case. Wow. I have to admit I didn't see that coming.
Yeah, I also think this is quite surprising and obviously really good news, because the police really should not be allowed to discriminate, because they are part of the state, and you can't just say that you won't pay for the police if you're not happy with their services.
Yep. And it's not also that. It's also that, but it's also the fact that the police is, is the institution that has a legal monopoly on violence. And when shit hits the fan, I would rather have the most qualified police officers trying to fix a situation. And Sweden kind of had some of these. Remember the Stockholm riot? And I would rather have that as opposed to individuals who are diverse but usually unqualified. And this article doesn't say, there's in some longer reports, it's also noted that besides this, the female favoring policies, there were also the non-Swedish favoring policies as well. Most of them implicit, not overt, but you can see it in the language tests, where essentially those that did the poorest in the language tests somehow managed to get admitted quite consistently. I mean, this is a pattern that has been going on for something like 80 years. It's not really a new phenomenon, but apparently 4 years ago someone decided enough is enough and was willing to invest 4 years of time and money to overcome this. And yeah, it's good to see the police at least admitting it exists, because 2 years ago there was quite a case. If you remember, we read on this show, or actually I read, you weren't yet the co-host here, a case about the fireman system, which was at that time also connected to the police services. Now, meanwhile, they have been separated, which also had an overt system like this, and turned out that because of that system, a few people have died in a fire, because, I don't know, it sounds politically incorrect, but female firefighters really aren't as good as male firefighters. They just aren't, as a rule.
Yeah, especially if you hire them preferentially, because then you get a lower quality of applicants.
Yes,
I mean, if you applied much lower standards to men, you'd also get bad male firefighters.
Absolutely, yes. And if the standards are so high that no woman ever is admitted, then so be it. And I was reading recently a piece of news from Serbia where the media was celebrating the fact that for the first time in 110 years since the Serbian Special Forces exist, a woman was actually admitted, because she actually passed all the tests. So the tests were so harsh that no woman was able to pass them for 110 years. But now finally one of them succeeded, and well, that's how it should be. I mean, if the standards are the same for everyone, if you pass it, you're getting in. If you don't, well, sorry.
Yeah. Of course, it's a question of, are these standards appropriate? Maybe they have, I don't know, too high physical requirements. I don't know. That could be the case, but certainly you should have the same standards for everyone.
Yeah, well, in Serbia, only the special forces is in this situation, and yes, the special forces does have quite high standards, but also special forces is, well, it's special forces. It's supposed to be special. So in that regard, I don't blame them. But yeah, I mean, it's good that this is happening, especially because it's happening in Sweden, where a lot of these institutions, the firefighters department, National Firefighters Department, and the police, have been subjected to this kind of affirmative action, which eventually can and will harm the public. I mean, how would you like it when you're being robbed on the street and screaming for the police, and you see the police officers being quite close to where the crime is happening, but the police officer can't answer and can't hear you or can't understand you because the police officer doesn't speak Swedish? And this can happen right now. Yeah. Because of extensive affirmative action towards non-Swedes, essentially. I mean, I have no problem with the Swedish police employing foreigners if they want to work there or if they're resident there, and okay, fine. But not speaking the national language, I don't think so.
Yeah, definitely. What I find interesting is what further ramifications this might have, because as far as I'm aware, there's a lot of affirmative action in favor of women going on in Sweden all over the place. Yep. So are those also then going to be challenged? That's the question, and that could have potentially much wider ramifications than just the firefighters.
Yes, but
or just the police.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. But as you know, in Sweden, just like most of Europe, it's a civil court system. So this,
of course,
this decision is not binding to everyone or things of that nature. No, it's binding for this case and this case only. So essentially, now everyone else, if they want to challenge, they can use this as a precedent to a certain extent. But that's pretty much it. It's going to have to be fought on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, but of course the fact that this case has been successful in this one instance, that also sort of shows how the law is probably interpreted by courts, and that it would probably also be interpreted the same way in similar situations.
Yeah, and it also raises the profile of Center for Justice, which they are, by the way, at their second case like this. Won in court in their second attempt, so 2 out of 2. So it kind of raises their profile too. Okay, let's go to the next one. Oh, the next one is absolutely fabulous. Is the kind of anyway, coming from Blitz, for a newspaper from Republic of Serbia. Mihajlović izboriti se sa radnom neravnopravnošću. Mihajlović cut the gender inequality. Including gender equality in budget programs is very important in the fight against gender inequality and the fight to ensure that women reach their full potential, said today the Serbian Deputy Prime Minister and President of the Coordinating Body for Gender Equality, Zorana Mihajlović. The statement was made after the opening of the seminar on the topic of gender-responsible budgeting in the Republic of Serbia at Hotel Zira in Belgrade, at the end of which it was agreed that Serbia will have in 2016 a gender-sensitive budget. And we all know that gender means women, so... Anyway, quote, I will say this, gender-responsible budgeting does not mean special benefits for women, oh, of course not, or separate budget for them, but that everything is planned in the fight against gender inequality that exists and allows the budget to make sure that spending is equally to both sexes. We will not allow women to remain an untapped potential, she said. This means, she added, that when the budget is to be made at the local level or at the state level, and when planning spending, the planning must be made in relation to the state of gender equality in the area. If that phrase doesn't make any sense, it's probably because it doesn't make any sense. Mihajlović said that the holding of seminars and exchange of experience is very important for Serbia. Well, for politicians, definitely. Minister Mihajlović, citing an example, said that when a local government separates the money for subsidies in agriculture, they conveniently separate the men who usually run the farms and thus don't allow a representation of the working women. Jesus fuck, is this modern Serbia or Socialist Federative Republic of Yugoslavia? Anyway. Quote, therefore one must take into account the fact that the budget is neither male nor female, but one must also take into account the way in which the budget is consumed, added Mihajlović. Assistant Minister of Finance, Mirjana Chojbasic, said that the ministry will support the introduction of the principle of gender equality in budget planning in at least one program, provided that gender sensitive is clearly defined and can be measured by an objective indicator. This event is a unique opportunity to learn and try to define gender-responsive programs that will be used for the budget of 2016, the Minister of Finance said. The director of UN Women in Serbia, Asia Varbanova, indicated that the goal is to be a leader in Serbia and that it is therefore important to exchange experiences as the organization encourages the principle of gender-responsive budgeting in more than 70 countries. Between 25 and 29th of May, 5 seminars with over 150 participants took place in which the participants became familiar with the plans of the Republic of Serbia's government in this area. The seminars are held in cooperation with the Ministry of Finance and the UN Agency for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, aka UN Women. Notice I said 150 participants, but in the original text, for participants, it's used the word участника, which means female participants. So, welcome to Serbia.
Indeed. And of course, we all know that when they say it will be used in a gender equal way, that's exactly what they mean. And when they say they want to find objective standards of measuring that, these standards will be completely objective and unobjectionable.
Yeah, and definitely enforced, because we all know that the Serbian government has an impeccable track record of enforcing its laws. Wait. The only portion that I really did appreciate is the statement of Asia Varbanova, the director of UN Women, who said that the goal is for us, i.e. UN Women, to become a leader in Serbia. Well, I agree. That is the purpose of every single UN Women agency around the planet. The purpose is to quite literally take over the finances of that country and rearrange them using an ideological lens. That is the truth. And congratulations to Mrs. Varbanova to at least being honest with her nonsense. I always like honest feminists, and I know some of you out there will say that, oh, there is no such thing as honest feminists. No, I disagree. There are honest feminists out there. 100% of the members of the Radfem Hub are very, very honest. They're most honest feminists out there. Ms. Varbanova, definitely an honest feminist. Harriet Harman, another honest feminist. Germaine Greer. There are quite a few honest feminists out there. So, yeah. One more thing I would like to say. I'm not convinced that even half of this will actually be enforced, given the fact, and I kind of know firsthand a little bit more about this, since, well, I went to Serbia. The Serbian government doesn't really has quite a track record of enforcing its laws, even the commonsensical ones, let alone bullshit ones. That's one thing. And another thing is that I think these UN Women events, as it happened in many other countries, including Iceland, they're usually just a way for some politicians to just have a good meal and some good drinking using UN funds. I mean, really, these kinds of seminars are rarely about their content and more about the networking, which is the politically correct way of saying let's drink on other people's time. I'm not joking. I really am not joking.
Yeah,
Anyway.
I guess life as a politician is quite stressful, and you have to do a lot of work and so on. So going drinking once in a while can be nice. Maybe you even get some good PR out of it. You can say that you're working on helping oppressed women and so on. That always plays well with voters. So what's not to like?
Yeah, fair enough. Although I would say that one of the reasons why I do care is that the fact that Serbia is not, I don't know, Belarus, where you don't have any feminist ideological programs, and well, you can ignore it a little bit more. But no, Serbia actually has a domestic violence establishment which is entirely ideological. You can read about that in my article, Domestic Violence Scandal in Serbia. It's almost 2 years old and nothing has changed since then. So, yeah, that's a little bit too bad that things are going down that path. Anyway, let's go to the last one in this part of the show.
Okay, this one is from Germany, from the Wirtschaftswoche. And it's an interview titled we mustn't exclude men. Marika Luley is a computer scientist and is on the board of the market-listed IT service provider GFT. We talked with her about why she opposes affirmative action for women and whether her son, and what her son has got to do with it. So this interview is quite long, so I skipped a few parts that are not really relevant to this show. So beginning in the middle here, basically. The interviewer: you are one of the few female high-level managers in the IT sector. How annoyed are you at being asked about your exotic status? I'm now quite fed up with it. We should rather be careful not to exclude the next generation of men. How do you figure that? Because of my 19-year-old son. In school, he experienced time and time again how girls are supported and get special treatment. Take the Girls' Day, for example, where girls' interest in so-called male jobs is encouraged, and thus they become competitors for my son, without him receiving the same level of support. He sees a woman in the Chancellor's office and also on the board of an IT firm. So he has little patience for the hypothesis that women are discriminated in the labor market. At some point he wished for a female job. Mine. That was sort of a wake-up call for me. What do you mean? That this isn't about just men and women, but about breaking up the behavior of dominant groups. This has nothing to do with gender-specific differentiation. This is why I reject the focus on women's advancement as too one-sided. But can you afford that in the age of women's quota? We can. Recently, the Federal Ministry for the Family, aka the Federal Ministry Against Men, as I like to call it, has once again honored us as being one of the most women-friendly employers, without us having any special programs for women's advancement. Apparently, we've been successful in combating mental and linguistic cliches. Cliches with which you grew up, and which I struggled with my entire life. Doing something just because everyone else was doing it was never something I accepted. Because I'd always liked mathematics and the natural sciences, I enrolled in the advanced physics course in my high school, as the only girl. How did your parents like that? Okay, but I came from a lower middle class background. After finishing high school, they would have preferred if I'd done an apprenticeship, worked for a little while, and then had children. But I wanted to go to university. But why computer science of all things? For pragmatic reasons. Back then my preferred subject, biology, was overcrowded. I wanted to study something technical, but I didn't like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, or teaching maths. Computer science was new and exciting, and at the Polytechnic I could finish quickly. And because I didn't want to do what everyone else was doing, aside from me, there were two other female students at the FH Darmstadt. So FH is Fachhochschule, which is something like a Polytech, among 70 students. We were exotic creatures at the Polytech. Back then, ladies' rooms were only on every other story, and the professors often collectively addressed us as gentlemen. Sometimes you didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. How did you endure this? It did bother me, but looking back it was a good lesson. I didn't want to go down a well-trodden path. I learned to endure mocking comments and doubts, to overcome obstacles, but also to find the right moments to hold back. I always ask myself whether what I'm doing is right. At the same time, I try to become independent of the opinions of others and to remove hurdles that are in my way. If you never have to overcome obstacles, you can't know what you actually want. Skipping a few paragraphs here. The interviewer says, women's advancements, ... and she continues, was completely foreign to the IT sector back then. For a long time, I was the only woman in a position of leadership in my company, and I had an all-male team. Now and then there was a boorish comment, but I never let that bother me. In the final instance, what mattered was the quality of my work, not my sex. That attitude that attitude had a major impression on me. And the article goes on after that, but that's basically all I'm going to read here. So I picked this piece of news not because it's really news, but because I think it's quite interesting. It sort of gives you a little bit of a look into what really is an independent woman and a strong woman who makes her own way and who does not depend on others to do her work or to help her along, but just someone who made her own way and who overcame obstacles and is above all not this sort of whiny, entitled thing that we have come to expect from feminists in recent years.
Yeah, and one of her comments: if you don't have to overcome obstacles, then you really don't know what you want. That's spot on, and it's the kind of comment that has become quite politically incorrect in some circles today. And sadly, and I see this even in this part of the world where traditionally school was supposed to be tough. It was tough before communism, it was tough during communism, it was tough after communism. But in recent years, there's been more and more pressure to make the school less tough because potato. And I don't get this. And in here, the Polytechnical University, it's still male dominated, but I've never seen the few women that actually do manage to go through the polytechnics whining about oppression or whatnot. Where does this idea came from that there's supposed to be oppression, and also this portion that our professors, you collectively addressed us as gentlemen. Well, so fucking what? How is that a problem, and why should it be a problem? In fact, if I am to be very cheeky on this, you're supposed to be proud of it. I mean, now you're part of the gentlemen. That should be an achievement, shouldn't it? Now, of course, facetious here, but
I can sort of understand how you might be annoyed at that, and sort of the this sort of assumption that that you're just this sort of exotic creature and that you're very different from everyone else and so on. That I can understand that this is annoying and so on, but this is something that that you can overcome. You can just and it's possible to go through that without letting that bother you too much, which is clearly what this woman did. So I sort of like her attitude about that.
Yeah, definitely she had and has the right attitude. But, well, I don't know, maybe I'm nitpicking, or maybe I have a low level of empathy for these kinds of things. I was the only guy in a classroom of girls, multiple times actually, and that never bothered me, like, at all. For instance, in when I was, I think I was like 8 years old or 9, my class elected collectively to do a calligraphy course as an extra course. And since I always had the crappiest handwriting that you could ever imagine, definitely a calligraphy course was not something that I would take lightly. So I started looking around in the school, what can I do and what can I take instead of the calligraphy course. I had to take another hour now because the classroom has elected so, but I could elect to go to another course. And the only course that was available in the sense that it still had seats was an arts course, which was essentially artistic painting. And there were 40 girls and 2 boys, me and another classmate of mine who also had a crappy handwriting. And essentially he asked me, can we do something? And I said, of course we can. Wherever there is a way, there is a will, there has to be a way. So yeah, and and the teacher that was teaching that class was also a woman, and I don't remember if she ever addressed us collectively as "come on, girls" or something like that. But she was definitely enjoying teaching to girls and not so much teaching boys. But that didn't bother me like at all. Actually, I learned the one drawing technique from her. So yeah, and that would be the earliest time. It happened a few more times afterwards in the school. But I never found that as a problem. I actually had quite a misandristic teacher. Uh, in the general school, I went to do an extra course of biology, and but it was a specific. It was biology of health or something like that was the name, and it was taught by a female teacher who said that an A is not for boys and definitely not for long-haired boys. And guess who was the only long-haired boys in the school? Well, that was me. So yeah, and you know what? I actually got an A from her eventually. I had to work quite a lot to do that, and I didn't find it as a problem. I thought of her as she's a cunt, but that was pretty much it. I mean, it never bothered me in the sense of affecting my self-esteem or what. Come on.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, sort of overcoming this sort of adversity helps you just to become stronger and to become and just work extra hard at that subject. Though of course, there's also students who then become discouraged and then just stop working altogether. So it's very different what sort of impact it has on each individual student.
Yeah, but if a cunty professor discourages you from a topic, then maybe you're not cut out to do performance in that subject to begin with, and well, tough shit. It's better to find out about that when you're 12 than when you're 25, I would guess.
I don't know.
I could be wrong.
I mean, certainly there's some truth to that, but I do think that there are people who could, with a supportive teacher, reach a reasonable level of proficiency in the subject, but who might just be turned away by having a bad teacher or a teacher who is unreasonably demanding. So I can sort of see both sides on that.
I agree, and that this is where we stray away too much, because this is a problem of mass education to begin with. I mean, this kind of problem doesn't exist only as in boys versus girls, but generally as in extroverts versus introverts, and it is a problem. Some say it's a feature. I vehemently disagree. It's a problem of compulsory state education, essentially. And where the individual learning is not encouraged.
Yeah, I agree with that, but that really leads us very far from the topic. But yeah,
indeed. Now, one of the reasons why I said why I came with those two examples from my own experience and generally, as you know, overcoming obstacles makes you stronger is precisely because in the second part of the show, we have two articles that show very interesting trends, and at least one of them is actually both of them are somehow related to this. You'll see in a moment. The first article in this second part of the show is from the Telegraph, which is essentially a good news presented as a bad one. If you remember when we had the show about positive news, we whined quite a lot about this. So the Telegraph titles, "Suicide is now the biggest killer of teenage girls worldwide." And here's why. Towards the end of last year, a shocking statistic appeared deep in the pages of the World Health Organization report. It was this: suicide has become the leading killer of teenage girls worldwide. More girls aged between 15 and 19 die from self-harm than from road accidents, diseases, or complications of pregnancy. For years, childbearing was thought to be the case, was thought to cause the most deaths in this age group. But at some point in the last decade or so, statistics were last collected on this scale in 2000, suicide took over. And according to the WHO's revised data for 2000, it had already just inched its way ahead of maternal mortality at the turn of the millennium. Yet somehow we didn't notice. So, essentially, death during childbirth has decreased spectacularly in the last 20 years, which is a tremendous achievement of humanity. Yet, that's not the news here. No, the news is that previously the third placed leading cause of death is now the first. Gee, I hate the
I
media
mean,
sometimes.
basically, something has to be the leading cause of death, no matter
Yes.
how few deaths there are. So saying that this is as something hugely problematic is just misleading, because you always can always have this headline that, you know, X is now the leading cause of death, or X is still the leading cause of death. Sounds really bad, but you're not really adding new information.
Yeah, and you know, when saying, well, it's now the leading cause of death, it can and usually does, unfortunately, induce the idea that, you know, the number of suicides has been increasing uh, for girls in the last, I don't know, 10 years or 15 years, when actually the opposite is true. The number of suicide in teenage girls has been dropping across the planet, and the number of maternal deaths has been dropping even faster than the number of suicides. So essentially, teenage girls are at their best historically at this point in time. Yet somehow that's a bad news. Fuck, I hate the media. Anyway, then the article goes really wrong, and I'm gonna have to read most of it. Quote, I heard of the statistic from Sarah Degnan Kambu, president of the International Center for Research on Women at the Gates Foundation breakfast last month. Most of my fellow guests worked in the fields of global women's rights or female health, yet they were as stunned as I was to hear it. I'm not quite sure why we haven't realized this before, says Suzanne Petroni, a senior director of ICRW. Maternal mortality has come down so much, which is fantastic, she says. So it takes 5 paragraphs, 6 actually, to actually say that this is good news. That's a major factor behind the fall in the overall death rate for 15 to 19-year-old girls from 137.4 deaths per 100,000 in 2000 to 112 today, 112.6. It's an amazing achievement. And it has also allowed the spotlight to fall finally on what has actually been the biggest killer all along, suicide. No, it wasn't the actually biggest killer all along. It wasn't. Amazing. The report looks at 6 global regions. In Europe, it is the #1 killer of teenage girls. In Africa, it's not even in the top 5, because maternal deaths and HIV are so high, says Petroni. But in every region of the world other than Africa, suicide is one of the top 3 causes of death for 15 to 19-year-old girls. For boys, the leading killer globally is road injury. Now, notice that for girls, the author says, well, it's top 3 in all continents, all regions except Africa. So his argument now seems like a global emergency. But further down the article, it also says that for boys, it's also in top 3 on all continents. Who would have thought? Anyway, gynocentrism intensifies. It's particularly shocking given that suicide is notoriously underreported. Well, I would disagree with that, but anyway. Leading causes of death for teenage girls: 1, self-harm; 2, maternal conditions; 3, HIV; 4, road injury; 5, diarrheal diseases. We don't really know the extent of the problem, says Roseanne Peace, senior supervisor at Childline UK, because the coroner often won't record it as a suicide. Sometimes that's the family's request, and sometimes it's simply to protect the family's feelings. I genuinely find that hard to believe, but anyway. In countries where stigma is particularly high, suicides are even less likely to be recorded than they are in the UK. And the poorest countries in the WHO's report have very patchy data on births and deaths at all, let alone reliable detail on what caused those deaths. Well, so it's a reporting problem. Anyway. In Southeast Asia, the problem is acute. Self-harm kills 3 times more teenage girls than anything else. The Eastern Mediterranean, which includes Pakistan, the Middle East, and the Middle East, has the 2nd highest rate. Professor Vikram Patel, a psychiatrist who was recently featured in Time magazine's 100 Most Influential People for his work on global mental health, is blunt in his diagnosis. The most probable reason is gender discrimination. Young women's lives in Southeast Asia are very different from young men's lives in almost every way. The male suicide rate in this age group is 21.41 per 100,000 compared to girls, which is 27.82. Okay, this is in the
Does not
age.
sound very different, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difference, but it's not a huge difference.
Yeah, and
Certainly not caused by their lives being different in every way.
Yeah, and again, when you look at globally, as the article tries to say, well, let's look at the problem globally. Well, let's look at the problem globally. The 15-19 segment is the only segment in the whole story about suicide where there are slightly more girls than boys. So, yeah. Anyway, this is going back to the article. This is the age at which girls may be taken out of school and forced to devote themselves to domestic responsibilities, forgetting all other abilities or ambitions. Okay. Hitting puberty can mean no longer being allowed to socialize outside the home. I can believe that in Pakistan, not so much in India or in many other places. But anyway, sometimes it can mean no longer being allowed out of the home at all, and sometimes it can mean forced marriage. Again, I can believe that in Pakistan, but most of the planet doesn't live in Pakistan. Anyway, Professor Patel was the founding director of the Center for Global Mental Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but now spends most of the year in Delhi, where he works for the Public Health Foundation of India. Indian media is filled with aspirational images of romance and love, he says. The ability to choose your life partners is an idea that's championed by Bollywood, but that's completely not the case in reality for most young women. I would disagree vehemently with that. Young brides, says Suzanne Petroni, are very often taken away from their peers. They're subjected to early and unwanted sex, and they're much more likely to experience partner violence than people who marry later. All of these put them at greater risk of suicide. If you're talking about India, that's 100% false. If you're talking about Pakistan, I won't try to dispute. In India, says Professor Patel, female suicide rates are highest in parts of the country with the best education and economy, probably because women grow up with greater aspirations only to find their social milieu limits them. In Professor Patel's view, 50% of those attempting suicide in China and India do not have a mental illness, that they just suffer logical despair. Well, what's a logical despair?
Well, I guess what they mean to say is that the situation is so bad that it makes sense to commit suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Not because you're depressed, but because the conditions are just so shitty.
Okay, but then again, it says the highest female suicide rates in India and China are exactly where the economy is better, best, and education is best. So
yeah,
it
I did
doesn't
not
really
say that the article was consistent.
Fair enough. Okay, the adolescent male suicide rate, though lower, is also extremely high in this region. Professor Patel's interviews with survivors of suicide attempts have led him to believe that for girls, gender issues are usually behind it. For boys, it's financial insecurities. Boys face great pressure to succeed and provide, which strikes me as a gender issue too, says the author of this article. It's a different problem from those suffered by women, but it's still a problem rooted in a rigid gender role. Leading causes for teenage boys are 1. Road injury, 2. Interpersonal violence, 3. Self-harm, 4. HIV, and 5. Drowning. In the UK, says Joe Fearns, the Samaritans Executive Director of Policy and Research, all of us in suicide prevention are most concerned by men. That's because almost 80% of all UK suicides are men, but, says Fearns, the majority of self-harm cases in the UK and presentations at A&E for self-injury are women. Part of the reason for the dramatically higher rate of male suicide in the UK and in most of the Western world is drugs and alcohol. Men are more likely to abuse both, leading to a more impulsive behavior. Sounds like conjecture to me. Evidence? Source? Men also tend to use more violent means and are less survivable. That's true. Rosine Pierce at Childline tells me that 75% of the girls who contact the service with suicidal feelings are either planning or have attempted an overdose, compared with just over half of the boys. Boys are much more likely to be planning or have attempted to hang themselves, a method with a far lower chance of survival. And this is where it goes full retard, seriously. Anyway, some of the disparity between the male and female rate is also down to circumstances, Fearns. He tells me that there is a higher than average rate of suicide among those working in heavy construction and farming because they have the means. Okay, and then it goes wrong. Far fewer women than men work in these environments. Rhea, not her real name, is 17 and has attempted suicide twice. Porn was everywhere in my school, she says. Her boyfriend Andy became obsessed with it. She'd made it clear, she says, that she wasn't ready to have sex, but one evening he sexually assaulted her in park. The assaults became routine. Rhea did nothing. Hmm. The constant talk about porn had made me feel like what was happening was normal, she says. She uses that word repeatedly to describe her attitude towards Andy's assault. Normal. I felt trapped, like everyone thought it was normal and I had to go along with it if I wanted to be accepted. The pressure to conform to those perceived expectations was so great that eventually Rhea said, I felt like there was no way out, and she tried to kill herself. The suicide attempt for young women in the UK is extremely high, says Professor Patel. He believes sexual pressure is the significant factor in their unhappiness. Rosine Pierce agrees, adding that sexting is another big issue among our callers. Girls become desperate and even suicidal because they've sent a picture and it's been posted online. There's also a relentless pressure on Western girls to look a certain way, to be fit and sexy. Well, these guys haven't been to Korea, haven't they? Anyway, the boys at Rhea's schools constantly compared the girls' bodies to women they saw in porn films, almost always negatively. Again, they've never been to Japan. But says Rhea, the strongest pressure comes from online media. Yeah, right, the internet has to be at fault. Kim Kardashian, for example, and all of her waist training stuff at the moment, the Kardashian sisters have been posting endless selfies on social media wearing waist slimming corsets. Loads of girls at my college are talking about it, and they're unhappy because it makes them feel insecure in themselves and like they have to try to look like that. Rosie Whittaker had been spending a lot of time on social media when she took her own life in 2012 at age 15. She wasn't looking at pictures of celebrities, though. Her aunt, Nancy Whittaker, tells me about the dark Tumblr accounts dedicated to self-harm that Rose was introduced to by a friend and was already a self-harmer, and that Rosie became immersed in herself. Tumblr kills. Anyway, they're very dark images of girls and are just skin and bones cutting themselves. It's like they're competing to see who can be the most shocking. She says you may have people who are not fitting in for whatever reasons, who have body image issues or are being bullied. Children who are vulnerable, and when they discover those websites, they think, oh, people understand me, they know how I feel. All of a sudden, they join the self-harm thing and they feel like they belong. But she continues, when you write something like, I'm fat, I'm ugly, I want to die, as Whittaker niece Rosie once did, instead of someone saying, oh, don't be silly, you're beautiful, they say, yeah, why don't you just go kill yourself? And when they're in such a vulnerable mindset anyway, complete strangers' words like that, Whittaker trails off. Pierce is familiar with what she describes as self-harm websites dominated by girls encouraging each other, trying to shock each other, trying probably just to get some attention. Dr. Amy Chandler, a research fellow at the Edinburgh University who specializes in self-harm and suicide, tells me that Western girls are more likely to self-harm than boys, and in her experience, their explanations for doing it are around control, their body being a site where they can exert control. Boys have other routes for expressing anxiety and distress, such as fighting. Girls turn to self-harm, she says, because it's not acceptable for them culturally to express anger in the same way. Now, I call bullshit on that. Anyway, the article goes a little bit more, but I think we got the gist of it. Do you actually buy this, that teenage girls kill themselves because, or teenage girls kill themselves at a worrying rate because someone said something nasty on Tumblr, or because they saw Kim Kardashian? I find that very hard to believe, considering that the overall number of suicide amongst women in all ages has been consistently dropping across Europe.
Yeah, I think that's just not really supported by the evidence, because then we would expect suicides to actually go up, which they're not. So, and I think bullying by peers is just a much more important problem in this regard than looking at celebrity photos or Tumblr or whatever.
Yes, but then again, bullying has been happening since forever, and it keeps happening, and it will happen for many years to come. And
yeah,
yet again,
but that is consistent with the pattern of suicides.
yes, yeah, fair enough. It does correlate. We don't have a causal link, but yeah, at least it correlates, and it kind of makes sense.
Unlike this online stuff.
Yeah, unlike this online stuff. I mean, look, I've been working recently with a few teenagers aged between 15 and 18 in a local scandal here where a bunch of teachers thought that this is still Ceausescu, Romania, and tried to pull a nasty things on some students because the students dared to make some memes and mocked them online. And I helped them with the legal stuff to essentially win their case against the school. So I've been in contact with quite a few teenagers in the last, let's say, 5 months, and also I'm still closer to their age, although increasingly less so. But anyway, that's a different story. I always related very well with teenagers. I mean, I taught classes in high schools, and I will keep on teaching them next year. I'm already booked to teach 3 such classes. So I've been in contact throughout the last. The first time I taught in school was in 2005. So for the last 10 years, I've quite been consistently in schools and teaching stuff and whatnot. I don't see any of these. I mean, maybe it's a cultural difference, but in this part of the world, if a boy says that you're fat or whatnot, usually the girls respond with "Go fuck yourself." Maybe your mother is fat, and some other things that I could try to reproduce them on the air, although that would be quite difficult given that Romanian is one of the languages with the very high amount of curses. I mean, Romanian, Serbian, and Hungarian are renowned to be languages with a lot of curses and expressions that. But essentially, the girls just don't seem to give a damn.
I mean, I wouldn't expect girls to be bullied by boys for the most part, but rather by other girls.
Yes.
I think that is a lot more prevalent.
Yeah, and also this. But when boys have anxiety, they express themselves through fighting or whatnot. But it's not culturally acceptable for girls to do so. Well, back when I was in school, in my classroom there were in 4 years 7 fights. 6 of them was girls on girls. And my experience is quite consistent with every single classroom, and almost all generations report that girls fighting physically each other was and is not so uncommon. Now, overall, school-wise or nation-wise, maybe it is less common because, well, boys, when they do fight, they actually do fight. But this sort of cat fight wasn't really that rare, and isn't really that rare. I don't think it's less culturally acceptable. It's almost equally culturally unacceptable.
Yeah, and just this idea that it's considered culturally acceptable for boys to fight and so on. That's not really the case. I mean, that stuff is punished in schools and so on, and it's not like they turn a blind eye to boys fighting but not girls. I would expect it rather to be the other way around, if they turn a blind eye at all.
Yeah, I mean, one of the fights that happened in my classroom, for instance, ended up with one of the girls needing medical attention. None of them were expelled, although they had some other disciplinary sanctions. On the other hand, in the high school that I studied in, the only person expelled for violence was my best friend. At least in the interval 1955 and 2015. In 1955, it was the previous student expelled for violence, also. Yeah, and my best friend was expelled obviously slightly later, but until today, since his moment, there was no one else. So that's why I'm not buying this, that it is culturally acceptable for boys to fight at school, or that it is more culturally acceptable for them to express their anxiety through fighting. I just don't buy it.
Yeah. Actually, there was somewhat disappointed that you skipped the last bit, because there was stuff I wanted to criticize there.
Oh,
So
go ahead.
I'm actually just going to read those parts. Young women in parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia are some of the most disempowered and marginalized.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I forgot the paragraph above. Um, Groups that have less power tend to be the most vulnerable. Suicide rates are consistently higher among the unemployed and the economically or socially marginalized. Young women in parts of the Middle East and Southeast Asia are some of the most disempowered and marginalized people in the world. Wait a second, wait a second, wait a second. Didn't this article just previously say that in India it's exactly the other way around? That people in the more affluent areas are more likely to commit suicide, and this is because they also offer the reason because they have higher standards and have higher ambitions and so on.
Expectations.
So
Yes, and also Middle East and Southeast Asia also includes portions countries such as Israel and countries such as Iran, which by the way still has the highest female to male ratio in universities in the world. By the way, so I just don't agree. It just can't be true that young women in Middle East and South Asia are the most disempowered and marginalized people in the world. So essentially, a young woman in an Iranian university is far worse than the homeless in Johannesburg, South Africa. I mean, come on,
yeah,
come on.
I don't know or the people in North Korea, for example,
Yes,
when they
people in
talk
North
about
Korea.
oppression.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
this is sort of the problem that exists with all this social science stuff, that you can just have a plausible explanation to fit any set of facts. You can even have two contradictory facts in the same article, and they come up with some plausible sounding explanation for each of them. But they can't be both true at the same time. It can't be a general trend when it's contradicted by something you have put earlier in your own fucking article.
True, true. And this is really a trend. I mean, as women's lives generally will keep on improving, and men's lives will improve as well as time goes by, but slower and going behind women's quality of life, especially in Europe and North America, but also elsewhere, as we see in India. But this kind of thing will be even more trendy. I mean, let's fit a gynocentric narrative everywhere now. So now suicide is a women's issue, even though in reality it just isn't. Or if you really, I mean, personally, I don't think it's a gendered issue to begin with, and I don't purport to know why people commit suicide, and I think it varies more even within the same country, because as we know, bigger countries don't have a consistent culture, and India is probably a good example of that. You can't expect to say that the entire country has the same culture. That's not gonna fly. So I don't think it's a gender issue to begin with. But if it were to be, it's definitely a male issue. So to pick the only segment where there is a slight difference, that is in the sense that more girls commit suicide than boys, and then make an entire article about that and say, oh, but this is a huge global emergency, that strikes me as gynocentrism intensifies. Maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, and you're not wrong. I think this is sort of a feminist sort of tactic that we've seen before, like for example with murders, where of course most murder victims are male, but if you look at a specific subgroup like people who are murdered by their spouse, then you actually have women being more likely to be murdered in that specific subgroup. So just write an article about that specific issue and just never mention the other stuff, and then it sounds like women are being targeted and so on, and when in fact it's most murder victims are indeed men. It's just a specific subgroup where you have the opposite pattern, and you can always sort of cherry pick your facts to make them seem to support basically any conclusion you want, which is you always have to be careful in articles like that, and even academic papers and so on. When you're confronted with statistics, you always have to ask yourself, what are they telling me, what are they not telling me, and where do they get their data, and do they just specifically cherry pick certain facts? You always have to be very careful with that sort of stuff.
Yep. And the final paragraph is, "Oh, gender is a pervasive global issue," says Patel, and as we're somewhat belatedly realizing the consequences can be fatal. Well, the child soldiers, 100% of them male, can confirm about that. What's your point?
Yeah, gender is a pervasive global issue. Everyone has one. Wow.
Amazing. Okay, and now let's go to our last discussion, also trendy when it comes to particularly teenagers. So go ahead, Jon.
Okay, this one is from the local.se from Sweden. Why Swedish girls are leaving home for ISIS. More girls and women than ever before are leaving Sweden to fight with terrorist groups like ISIS. The local speaks to terrorism expert Magnus Ranstorp from the Swedish Defense University about what's luring them to leave one of the safest countries in the world to wage jihad. How do groups like ISIS recruit Swedish women? The targets are groomed, usually by other women. Recruiters start by targeting girls who seem vulnerable. They might display serious conservatism and religiosity, for example, and can be manipulated into believing a romantic image of Islam, glorifying the afterlife and the heroism of mujahids or fighters who later become shaheeds or martyrs. There's also the whole issue of sex appeal. Some young women look up to the fighters like pop stars. Then there are others who are more ideologically motivated. The recruitment often starts online with girls contacted via Facebook. It sometimes starts with questions about whether they are married. The conversation might then move offline when recruiters might invite the girls to take part in a small study groups with like-minded women. There are lots of different sources targeting the girls and young women. All the recruitment is done through Swedish, but some of the recruiters are working from places like Raqqa in Syria, while others are on the ground in Sweden. For a lot of girls, this is a form of emancipation in a perverse way. They think they are getting away from the leash of patriarchal structures in their families or the areas where they live. What better way to give the finger to society than to join ISIS? How many Swedish women have left to fight with the terrorist groups in the Middle East? There are growing numbers leaving, and we've seen an increase over the last year. There are more than 30 in all, but that figure doesn't tell us the whole story since it just covers people who have gone voluntarily. A lot of girls and boys are also brought along by parents. Some children are born in Raqqa. We also had one case last year where 6 or 7 girls from Somali families in Järve in Stockholm all left together. Most of the girls being recruited have left from Stockholm and Gothenburg. One of the earliest cases we saw was that of a Swedish woman known as Faten Fida, who was married to a British jihadist, Ibrahim al-Mazwagi. They had a child before he died in battle in 2013, and she's now very active in recruiting other Swedish women from her base in Manbij in Syria. What can Sweden do to stop would-be foreign fighters from leaving? The authorities hear things. You would think these things were hidden in the undergrowth, but people talk and it becomes an open secret when someone's planning to go. Non-recruitment even occurs in the open, and it's pretty well known who you should go to for recruitment. If the girls are under 18, the authorities can and do intervene, but if they're over 18, there's not a lot anyone can do. The under 18s can be temporarily placed in care, or Sweden can refuse to issue a passport. But these legal means don't work for over 18s. Is enough done to combat recruitment? I'm pretty pleased with how things are developing in Angered and in Gothenburg and in Örebro. Specific interventions are working bottom up to firefight. I see a lot of criticism of the municipalities for being too soft, but they're the ones that need to do prevention work. They can leave the more repressive side of things to the police and security services. One needs to view prevention through a security perspective. It's better to have contact with them than to have live, walking hand grenades moving around without supervision. That being said, there's a very uneven response across cities. It is difficult in Stockholm, where it's very spread out and there are lots of different municipalities involved. Malmö is not doing so much. They need to cooperate a lot more with Copenhagen, where there are several radical mosque environments just half an hour away. What happens when they decide to leave Sweden? They're told how to travel, what to do and where to hide. First, they are directed to safe houses in Turkey. There are separate guest houses for men and women in Reyhanli on the border with Syria. They also meet with the facilitators in Turkey. Some of these facilitators are only in it for the money and loot the women's possessions as soon as they've sent them on their way. Once they get to places like Raqqa and Manbij in Syria, they are relatively quickly married off. The younger ones are more likely to be pushed into temporary one-day marriages, where they are effectively passed around between different men, almost like the Yazidi slaves captured and raped by ISIS fighters. Others, usually the older ones, marry and are okay. They settle and have children. Then there are special kids camps where they are indoctrinated, maybe taught to handle light weapons, and sometimes made to participate in horrific propaganda videos. Children are also very much encouraged to listen in on their parents. ISIS have created a child spies who they pay for information. It's a Stasi-like culture of fear. So, here again.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I chose this is not that it happens in Sweden. It's a phenomenon that's happening in several countries in Europe. It's happening in France, it happens in Britain, it happens in Denmark. So it's not really a unique feature of Sweden. What I wanted to know is essentially whether that the Swedish culture has a fault in this, because even this article says that but those poor little girls will believe that they can evade from the patriarchal structures in their homes. Well, who taught them that their homes are patriarchally oppressive? Who taught them?
Yeah.
Wasn't maybe the fucking Swedish school system? Just saying. Just fucking saying.
Yeah, and of course it's also very important to teach them that all cultures are equally valid and that there's no such thing as a superior or inferior culture, or that you can't look down on these people because that would be Eurocentrism and very evil and so on. That's
and racist. Don't forget racist.
And racist, of course.
Because seriously, I mean, okay, now it's only 13 cases, but still
30, I think.
30, sorry. Okay, 30 cases in a population of 9.5 million. It's not really that much, but again, given that now some other nations have adopted this nonsense of teaching young kids feminist notions about everything, most recently France, even more recently Italy, it's a culture within the educational system, and this is particularly problematic in Sweden, less problematic in Italy or France, where it's a very closed system, and it's compulsory to go even from the age of 4, I think, in Sweden, and they're even talking to lower that to 3. So essentially, you're mandated to go there. You don't have a choice as a parent or as an individual. Homeschooling has, in the meantime, became de facto illegal after the case of the Johanssons in 2012, when the state literally kidnapped the kid from the plane. That's a different story. But anyway, so essentially all kids are mandated to go there, and as soon as they get to the age of 9 or 10, this kind of nonsense begins, that their families are patriarchal, that their families are oppressive, and so on and so forth. A lot of them learn about this shit. And you know, ISIS is just what, 1 year old. Uh, the generation that started learning these things 2 years or 3 years ago will soon be 15, 16, 17. It's a time bomb, for fuck's sake.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much that is really about feminism. I think it's more sort of generally this sort of anti-Western
Yes,
these
I'm
anti-Western
indicting.
ideas that are
Mhm,
sort of taking root in the educational system, and
mhm.
starting from the universities down, and now it's filtering down to the primary and secondary schools.
And
This
even
sort of idea,
preschools in Sweden. Yes, go
yeah, this
ahead.
sort of idea that we have to be very critical about Western culture, and we don't want to be colonialists and so on, and um, we have to look very critically at history and where white people always oppress everyone else and so on. Um, I think this sort of narrative is very problematic because it just distorts reality so much. I mean, certainly there were many injustices committed by Westerners, but these same kinds of injustices have also been committed by every other culture. But it just currently in recent times, it just seems to me quite obviously that Western culture is really, really good compared to the alternatives. That you have you have all these countries being freer, more prosperous um, than any other countries or any other culture. So
Mhm.
constantly trying to down talk that and to point out all the flaws and so on, it just creates this very distorted picture, which just um, leaves people with the wrong impression that other places are much better, and that other cultures are, I don't know, more natural or more I don't know, more environmentally friendly or some such nonsense. And this sort of I think it's more this that drives people into
Mhm.
rebelling in this way by joining this sort of uh, most crass anti-Western organization imaginable, basically.
Yes, and we have to say it. This thing, although in Sweden it's quite unilateral, it's the grand leftist coalition that's doing it. In other places, such as my country, such as the United States, there is also an element within the political right that also believes that the West is too corrupt to be redeemed and things of that nature. But what most of the individuals perpetrating these kinds of narratives uh, what seems to unite them is this utopian thinking that nothing is good enough, or the lack of understanding that good enough is good enough. I mean, yeah, sure, Europe isn't perfect, Sweden isn't perfect. Well, so fucking what?
Yeah, and I mean it's completely legitimate and positive to criticize Western culture, but then you have to apply similar standards to other cultures too, and you also have to
Yes.
criticize the many bad things going on there too. And by any sort of reasonable standards, Western culture comes out pretty good. But
Hmm.
if you just apply this sort of one-sided standard that you just um, criticize everything Western and sort of just blindly accept everything non-Western, you just get this completely distorted image.
Yeah, and this kind of narrative has been harming, and this is the point that I insist on making. This kind of narrative actually does harm women. And it doesn't harm just the 30 Swedish women who more or less voluntarily went uh, to Syria or the Islamic State. Uh, think about Rotherham. Now, the report on the situation in Rotherham in Britain, maybe it was a bit exaggerated and it wasn't a perfect report, but at the end of the day, there were at least 200, if not a bit more, girls who have been victim of at least sexual assault, if not rape, by non-Western perpetrator, completely tolerated by individuals schooled by an organization called the Common Purpose, who essentially is busy teaching soon-to-be public officials to think that everything Western is dirty and everything non-Western is multiculturalism and diversity and therefore a priori good. This is a reality. And a reality that harms women, and it's almost ironic that it's on this show we have to talk about it. Amazing.
Yeah, it seems very ironic because you would think that feminists and would be or generally people on the left would be the most pro-Western because you have the most quote-unquote gender equality in Western countries, or at least what they see as gender equality. And all these affirmative action laws and so on. That's something that is it's coming in many non-Western countries, but it's mostly something that's been implemented in the West. So these people should be celebrating Western culture.
Yeah, but then how do you fit in multiculturalism in there? Now that's a conundrum.
Yep.
Yeah, and I hope I will be wrong, but in my view, this is going to be quite a growing trend for as long as the Islamic State will exist, corroborated with the, as you said, the generalized anti-Western narrative propagated as much as possible in schools in several European countries. I think the number of women who will go in places like the Islamic State will just keep on growing. I hope I will be proven wrong by the evidence, but I don't think I will.
Though I think it's interesting to know actually what are the numbers of men going there. So I don't know how that compares. So
well, admittedly, the number that I know is 6 months old, but in December it was reported that something like 70 Swedish citizens in total have went to the Islamic State. So it's probably, considering that there were 30 women, so I guess it's 30 to 40.
Okay, so about equal or maybe a bit more.
Surprisingly equal for Sweden. On the other hand, in Britain is an overwhelmingly male population emigrating there. For other countries didn't even bother to write about it. I've tried to look for the numbers in France. No luck. Maybe there are somewhere buried, but I wasn't able to find them.
Okay. Yes.
And again, these are the numbers of actual citizens who are going there. It doesn't count, individuals who emigrated into Sweden, let's say 20 years ago. They never bothered to ask for citizenship and then suddenly left for the Islamic State. Something like that is not counted in the statistics. So, yeah.
Okay. So it is still generally more of a male phenomenon, more men leaving, which is of course what I would have expected because I don't know going. I mean, I can sort of see that if you're some sort of fanatical Islamist, then it may sound appealing to go there and to fight for ISIS, but go there and just get married off to some jihadist. That doesn't sound very appealing to me. I don't know.
Yeah, at least
maybe I just don't have what it takes to be an ISIS wife or something like that.
Yeah, admittedly, it's quite expected to be more men than women, and of course, as you say, yeah, it does make sense. I mean, if you're a radical Muslim, at least you can go there and test your ideology against evidence. I mean, yeah, it's sad and funny in the same time, and it was, I think, The Independent, of all places, published an article about an ex-Muslim who essentially went to the Islamic State and then came back from there an atheist. So yeah, I guess there are some good news in that regard. At least you get to test your worldview against evidence, and maybe some of them will just look at the evidence. Although I prefer to look at the evidence on YouTube and not from the ground. Maybe that's just me. But yeah, I mean, again, I really hope I'll be proven wrong by evidence, but these kinds of these two things just seem too correlated. And I believe this academic from the Swedish Defense University, because that's one of the Swedish universities that is not known for promoting bollocks as a rule. I mean, it's not like the Umeå University or even worse, the Uppsala University, who have a long tradition of promoting utter nonsense. I mean, Uppsala University now promotes femofascism, but it's not the first form of fascism that it promotes. Uppsala University was the main generator of racial scientists in the 20s and 30s in Sweden. Also the main generator of communist professors in the 50s and 60s, including those who founded a magazine that advocated for Sweden to join the USSR, if you can believe that. So yeah, the Uppsala University has an impeccable track record of nonsense. So that's why when I see, according to a report issued by Uppsala University, the first thing I do, let's see if anyone else corroborated that, because that's usually not the case. But the Swedish Defense University, as a rule, tends to be quite reserved when it comes to nonsense, and I just don't remember something very bizarre or outright wrong promoted by them since I've started looking to Sweden closely, and it's been a while since I've been looking at Sweden closely. So that's why I tend to believe this academic when he assesses that at least in part some of those girls leaving Sweden to go to the Islamic State might actually think that they're escaping a patriarchal family and things of that nature, and that's why I'm taking it seriously. And yeah, it kind of pisses me off because we know who taught those girls that their families are patriarchally oppressive.
Yeah.
Okay, then with that being said, I think we've ranted quite enough, and I generally don't have anything else to say. So, any final messages, Mr. Gunnarsson?
Yes, take the red pill.
This has been a production of A Voice for Man. Lucian, Vâlsan and his guests, thank you for listening to The Voice of Europe. A Voice for Man radio is not corporate media and everything runs on donations. So please consider visiting avoiceforman.com and make a donation. We would also like to thank the artists De Prima Terra, Bezna, Cristian Buica, the Iranian band Arsames, the DDG Project, and all the other artists that offered us their songs to use under Creative Commons license. Special thanks go to www.eacdv.com/sounds for putting the sounds of the jingles at our disposal. We would also want to remind the listeners to take the red pill. Thank you for listening to us and have a great evening.